So in this video, we're going to be talking about data sources inside the feed stack. We're going to be focusing on just the data sources, kind of how to use each one and the differences between them. Okay. So when you add a feed stack to the page, as you notice, you can click on this blue button and you can add any of the default feeds here. So if you buy just the feed stack, you get CSV, JSON, RSS, and Total CMS blog. There is also a database pack. And in the future, we'll be releasing more data packs that will add more different types of data feeds. Okay. But let's go with the data feeds that we have now, just so you can kind of get an idea of how things are used. So the CSV feed, pretty simple. When you add the CSV feed stack to your page, there are many different ways to supply CSV data. You can just simply paste the CSV data directly into the CSV data setting. Now, I should note that this is actually used inside Preview no matter what else you supply. This allows Preview to be super fast. So even if you're bringing in data from a CSV on a URL or a file on your server, just take a sample of that data, paste it into this setting so that we can ensure that Preview is really fast. Now, on Publish, we can go ahead and use File on the server. This allows you to give a path to a CSV file that is on your server. And last but not least, you can do a file URL, which is a URL to a CSV file. This URL can be on your website, although if it's on your website, I'd recommend using a file on the server instead. Where you're going to want to use file URL is when you're integrating with an external service. One example of that is Google Sheets. Google does allow you to share a Google Sheet and get a CSV URL of that Google Sheet. So you can definitely do that. Now, one caveat, I strongly discourage you from adding Google Sheets into this workflow. The reason is Google Sheets is always going down and having issues. So I really am going to discourage you from using Google Sheets. But you can. Now, when you use a file URL, there is an expire setting because feeds will cache that so that it doesn't need to fetch that CSV file on every single page load. I recommend you make this as large as possible so that for performance reasons, it's just going to, use the cached CSV that's going to be cached on the server versus going out and fetching the raw CSV file from a URL every X number of minutes. So I definitely recommend making this as large as possible, an hour maybe, if you're okay with that. Obviously, what that means is if you change that data inside the URL, it could take up to that amount of time for the data to be actually displayed on the website. Next up is RSS. And RSS works very similar to the CSV feed, okay? In that you can give it a URL. It has the same expire time. You can also get the RSS metadata instead of all the posts. So if you want the actual data about the RSS feed, like the main website data, you can get that. And then there's a couple RSS specific options for date formatting and forcing the date order. Not all RSS feeds actually are sorted by date. So if you want to force that date order, you can use that checkbox there. JSON. JSON's very similar. We have the ability to give it a URL to a JSON file. Here you can actually supply a data path, okay, to a subpart of a JSON file, right? So in this example here, I'm going down into products dev inside the JSON file, and then I'm actually analyzing the JSON data that's within products dev, okay? And then we have an expire date for JSON as well. Total CMS, super easy. Supply the CMS ID of your blog and you're done. Now, why would you want to use a blog feed versus anything else? Most because feeds has some more filtering and sorting data that a blog list doesn't have. So there is a use case of integrating feeds with Total CMS. And lastly, databases. I'm not going to go through every single database setting. They're all very similar. All of them have the ability to supply CSV data so that you can preview your layout inside Preview. Because we can't connect to your database from your Mac, it would need to be an external connection, obviously, because your database is on your web server. So we allow you to provide CSV data so that you can actually preview and build your layouts. And then you have the various data connections. Okay, so here we have a MySQL so that we can give the host name, port, username, password, and all that jazz. Okay, very similar. For database queries, we allow you to just bring in all data from a table. You can limit the number of records from a table, and then you can just do a custom SQL statement. So this obviously requires that you know a little bit of SQL, so you can write your own SQL select statement and paste that in there. Now, the last bit I want to review for this is analyzing and knowing the data. I'm going to use RSS as an example because RSS is kind of a wild, wild west standard. Now, Feeds does a best job that it can to kind of standardize it for you, but knowing the exact fields that are available within an RSS feed is not necessarily reliable. So inside the main feed stack, there's a data preview button. And when you click that and preview, what that will do is it will actually display the raw data in a readable format for you to see. So we'll see within this particular RSS feed, I have access to the author field, contributor, content, copyright, so on and so forth. We can actually see the raw data for each of those fields. We can see which fields are being used, which aren't. And you can see it for every single record. So this will allow you to easily build and integrate that data into your layouts. And last but not least, if you might have noticed inside of this CSV Feeds demo, I actually have multiple data points. So Feeds allows you to actually integrate as many data sources as you want into a single feed layout. Now, this could get interesting or odd if the CSV and the JSON have different types of data. You definitely want to make sure that, if you're going to mix types, then the data has to be similar and have the same values and whatnot. So that definitely is a little iffy because, making sure you have multiple formats that have the same similar data types is probably not it's definitely an edge case scenario. But you can have, as you see here, I can have multiple CSV feeds. I don't think it's very common. You're probably only going to have one data source, but it is very interesting that we can actually integrate multiple data sources into a single feed.